joining us today for this first of two webinars on AI legislation and regulation. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available hopefully sometime this weekend. I want to thank everybody for attending, and as I'm speaking, more people are joining, which is great to see. This webinar is sponsored by the Chicago Association of Law Libraries and is specifically the Government Relations Committee. I want to thank the other members of the Government Relations Committee for their support. That committee consists of Diana Kopang, who is the co-chair this year, Russ Prolich, Sally Holterhoff, and our board liaison, Kristen Nyack. I also want to thank our two presenters for their time today and sharing their wisdom with us. With us from Bloomberg is Chris Marr. Chris is an Atlanta-based senior correspondent for Bloomberg Law. He writes about labor and employment law in state legislatures and in the courts, including policies and litigation targeting employers' use of AI tools. His past reporting experience includes writing about tax. Yay! I cut my teeth as a researcher in tax, healthcare, and environmental policy for Bloomberg Law, as well as covering corporate mergers and acquisitions for Merger Market. Chris is a graduate of Berry College in Georgia. Also, we are joined by Oma Sadiq, is a technology policy reporter for Bloomberg Government in Washington, D.C. She covers how companies are influencing federal policy on artificial intelligence, online safety and privacy, and other priorities on Capitol Hill. She previously worked at Business Insider and Politico, and holds a journalism degree from Northwestern University. I presume that would be the Medill School of Journalism.
Yeah.
I also want to thank Madeline Cohen. Madeline Cohen works at Bloomberg Law, and she is, for want of a better word, the library relations person. Madeline, I'm not sure exactly if that's your title, but she was instrumental in helping me or helping the committee find Chris and Oma to speak on today's topic.
My pleasure.
Let's see. Going through. I'm going to ask folks to mute themselves. We will be using the chat. The plan is we were going to leave some time for question and answer. So if you would put your Q&A in the chat, we'll get to as many of those as possible. And now, first off, I'd like to hear from both Chris and Oma. We'll start with Oma. Can you give us a little bit of background on how you personally became interested in this whole world of AI regulation, and how what you're seeing has been impactful to you? And we'll start with Oma.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eugene, and thank you all for having me today. I'm excited for this discussion. So I started covering tech policy 3 years ago now for Bloomberg, and it was, the second week I started when OpenAI CEO Sam Altman testified before the Senate for the very first time. It was his very first congressional testimony. And since then, AI policy has been a whirlwind at the federal level, across the states. It's really, I would say that 3 years ago in May 2023 is when we saw this pivot from tech policy going beyond just data privacy and security and safety issues to artificial intelligence. And so since then, you've just seen a wave of government responses across the world. And it's all a matter, it's all in efforts to sort of dominate the AI market. You have companies who are in a fiercely competitive space. I mentioned OpenAI, but there's Meta, there's Google, there's Microsoft, there's Anthropic. There are so many companies fiercely competing in the space, not only domestically, but again, internationally. And the main competition right now is coming from China with their models, their leading models, notably DeepSeek. And in response, you've seen mixed reactions from the public. This time a few years ago, there was a lot more hesitation around AI, but people were quickly embracing the tool. Employers have moved to embrace the tool. But now, 3 years later, after 3, 4 years later, after the release of ChatGPT, we've started to see more negative public sentiment in regards to AI. And as a result of that, you are seeing state legislatures specifically move to respond to that, to put in place some protections. I can get into more of the specifics there, but at a high level, AI has really transformed the global economy. It's going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to see industries from healthcare to finance to legal to education and elsewhere racing to adopt these technologies to stay up to speed. We're going to see some repercussions because of that on the workforce, and I'm sure Chris can get into that more detailed. But yeah, it's rapidly evolving, and governments are really just trying to keep up at the moment.
Excellent. Chris, how about you? How did you start on your path in looking at and writing about AI, specifically in the employment and labor space? How did you come to this world?
Yeah, thanks, Eugene. Happy to be here. Uh, I've been probably covering this as part of my broader labor and employment law beat for about 2 years now. And those who have been following it probably know that that traces back to Colorado becoming the first state in 2024 to pass this really broad legislation aimed at algorithmic bias and the ways that employers use AI tools in making decisions. Not just employers, but lots of different types of decisions around housing and credit and education. The Colorado legislation is pretty broad. Um, that's a law that has yet to take effect and might not take effect depending on what the legislature does in the next few weeks here in Colorado. But I think that was the one that sort of really grabbed my attention. Of course, several months prior to that, New York City had passed an ordinance around algorithmic bias and employment decisions, which I think a lot of people feel like ended up not having a lot of teeth. It was sort of written in a way that a lot of businesses felt like they could say, well, that doesn't really apply to the way we use AI tools. But yeah, I think Colorado was the first big one that got my attention. And then on the litigation side, I know everybody watching this space is watching Mobley versus Workday in the Northern District of California. And that, of course, that case has been around since 2023. I think it was in 2024 that we got, the first sort of interesting initial ruling where the judge said, okay, this case is going to basically be allowed to go forward. There is some legal basis for potentially, finding that a service or technology provider like Workday could be liable for employment discrimination, based on the decisions that are ultimately made by the employers using the technology. So I think those are kind of the two big ones that got me started on covering this as part of the labor and employment beat. And of course, there's been a lot of talk since then, a little more litigation, in terms of the employment decision-making tools. Plenty more litigation on other things like chatbot liability. But kind of slow going in the state legislatures. We've seen a lot of sort of narrow slices of AI related bills passed, but when you're talking about the really big kind of employment decision making or algorithmic bias bills like we saw in Colorado, most of those are getting shut down, and it seems like, as Oma alluded to, the sort of heavy lobbying from the tech industry probably plays a big role in that. And now also this year, the push from the Trump administration to preempt or at least rein in states as much as possible and push for more of a federal standard.
Excellent. Chris, you mentioned several times algorithmic bias, and that in a effort at shameless self-promotion, I'd like to call everyone's attention to a book entitled The Algorithm: How People Are Hired, Monitored, and Fired Using AI. If you are a member of MAL, I wrote a book report, for want of a better word, on that book in the latest edition of the MAL Markings Journal. If you would like a copy of that book report, for want of a better word, please let me know. I'll be happy to share that with you. Getting a little more granular, I'd like to talk a little bit about, in broad strokes, in terms of a survey of AI regulation. I'd like to help the audience better understand who and what states, should I say, is taking a more activist stance in terms of AI regulation, who is treating it in a more laissez-faire manner, and what have been the responses currently, and what do you project the responses will be by the current administration to those efforts? And I will start with Chris. We'll start with you. You're in the middle of the screen now. Let's hear from you.
Sure. So, not surprisingly, when you're thinking about who's taken the more, I guess, heavy-handed approach to legislation, it tends to be your states with Democratic majority legislatures. We've seen some regulation coming out of California, although there again on the algorithmic bias piece, the legislature has been a little hesitant, and that has been addressed more through agency rulemaking, through their civil rights agency and also their privacy agency. Of course, there's the Colorado legislation that is supposed to take effect June 30th, but the governor is pushing hard for some legislation that would revise that and scale it back significantly before it takes effect. Illinois has a law that took effect January 1st. It's relatively bare bones if you compare it to the Colorado law. It basically just says to employers, if you discriminate using an AI tool, that is illegal discrimination, just the same as if you discriminate without using an AI tool. And then there's also a notice requirement that employers have to give employees and presumably job applicants notice if they're using an AI tool in employment decisions. I think a lot of us have been expecting that the state labor department would issue some regulations giving a little more detail about what that notice has to entail and when and where it should show up. And I think there was sort of a draft version that floated around privately late last year, but they haven't actually published regulations. So it's still kind of, you have to give notice, but it's anybody's guess what that entails. And beyond that, it's been, on the algorithmic bias piece, it's been a lot of states have considered bills, but not a lot have passed. We've seen bills come up for the last 2 or 3 years in Washington State, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts. There are still some bills in Massachusetts that are live for the next few months and could pass there, but a lot of states have left those on the table multiple years in a row. Again, probably partly due to heavy lobbying from the tech industry, and maybe partly due to state lawmakers kind of acknowledging this is a really complex, hard to understand technology in terms of how it works behind the scenes, and what's the right approach to try to limit the potential for bias. Texas did pass some legislation last year, but there again, it was sort of on the light side. Like the Illinois bill, it just sort of acknowledged that discrimination using an AI tool is illegal discrimination. It imposed some obligations on state agencies when they use AI, but beyond that, no real, notable obligations on private sector companies using it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, as far as the algorithmic bias piece, there's been a lot of talk in the legislatures, kind of limited action. And I think everybody's watching to see what's going to happen in Colorado. There again, the pressure from the Trump administration on preemption, or trying to preempt, or threatening funding, or threatening lawsuits against states that are deemed to be too heavy-handed and sort of getting in the way of innovation as the administration sees it. I think that has hampered some of the state efforts this year.
Mm-hmm. Oma, do you have anything to add on this specifically, like who's being more heavy-handed, who's being more laissez-faire with regulation?
Yeah.
What is your reporting shown?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say the states aren't taking a back seat here, especially because they're trying to fill this regulatory gap left by Congress. Congress has not passed any sort of sweeping AI regulation at the moment. So a lot of states, like Chris mentioned, Colorado is a leading one, California is another one. California recently enacted regulation that would require some of these what we call frontier AI labs. So think OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, Meta to submit and share their safety testing results of their, really powerful advanced AI models. We're seeing that also happen in New York State. So, and beyond just more of these, high level models, you're seeing a lot of states move to implement in recent years more to address more targeted risks. So there's been a lot of new laws and regulations around deepfakes, which is, those generative AI images that can mimic people, they can mimic ourselves through voice, through visuals, through video. And so you've seen states like Virginia implement new laws that would restrict deepfakes in specific contexts. So, if it's in non-consensual use of pornography, you've seen restrictions there. You've seen restrictions in elections. So, prohibiting elected officials or campaigns at the state level from using deep fakes of themselves or their opponents. And this is all to crack down on what some of the more targeted risks of AI as it relates to misinformation and disinformation and individual rights. And so you're starting to see plenty of states. I mean, all 50 states have introduced, dozens of AI related legislation. Like Chris said, a lot of them have not made it all the way to the finish line, to the governor's desks and signed and enacted. But a good chunk has. And that's why you see the federal government now reacting to that, because you have all these companies, not only the big companies, like I mentioned, but the smaller players, the smaller startups who are trying to enter this space and compete, coming to Washington and saying, hey, we cannot handle this sort of 50 state regulatory landscape. We need one national standard to abide by. And Congress is now trying to respond to that. The White House just last month put out its vision of an AI framework, what that might look like. And what that entailed with this current Trump administration, there is a very pro-innovation approach. What that means is they want to do as little as possible to hinder the AI industry to support their growth. Again, from what I said before, to be able to compete nationally, globally, and to compete in this race against China. And so they have pushed a very deregulatory approach. They want to do things like streamline energy permitting so that companies can more easily find the energy to prop up new data centers. They want to support further research and development. They want to limit sort of this safety testing, but they are calling for some more, again, specific targeted guardrails. They want to protect minors. So there's a lot of concerns around, especially minors interacting with chatbots. You've seen a lot of lawsuits related to that. So they want to target that. They want to have minors have more pleasant interactions or limiting negative interactions with chatbots. They want to ensure, especially as I mentioned with data centers, they want to ensure that consumers are not experiencing higher energy or electricity rates because of these new data centers forming in their neighborhoods that require lots of energy to get online. And other more targeted areas of risk. They're not really thinking to do something sweeping like you saw in California of requiring or like putting, obligations onto companies to submit testing or share their safety mechanisms. They just want to do this minimal sort of incremental approach, and you're starting to see lots of legislation, a lot of it bipartisan too on Capitol Hill. But the real, tricky part is to get that consensus around a single framework. The lawmakers are trying. Whether or not we'll see action imminently remains to be seen, especially because it's a midterm term year, so they're going to be out on the campaign trail soon. So they have a limited window for legislative action, but they're definitely feeling the pressure because you have these companies knocking on their offices saying we cannot comply with this. And you also have, on the other hand of it, a lot of tech safety and consumer advocates now saying like, hey, we need to have some common sense guardrails. The public is waking up to this technology. They're noticing the effects of it, and they want to see some action.
You both make an interesting point, and one of the things that keeps buzzing in the back of my mind as you're both talking is the in my mind the apparent disparity, for want of a better word, in terms of the skill level between the people making the policy and the tech companies. I mean, we all remember those hearings where the social media companies went before Congress, and it was quite obvious that quite a few members of Congress were, I'm trying to find a polite way of putting this, really unaware of what the nature of that business was, what the nature of the business model was. And I was wondering if, from what you're seeing, from what you're reporting, has that gap broadened? Has it narrowed? Are the regulatory agencies, both in the state and the federal level, and the elected officials, getting better, more savvy individuals to help them, or is it still sort of in my mind, a David and Goliath sort of a proposition?
Yeah, I can start.
Please.
I mean, you raise a really great point, Eugene, and I think this is why you tend to see, especially at the federal level, government moves slowly to regulate. It's an emerging technology. The technology is rapidly advancing at a much faster pace than anyone probably could have anticipated, and so Congress is trying to reckon with that. I want to say you have in the 535 member body, there are probably two computer scientists or two or three computer scientists. So yes, within the body itself, there is not a very strong tech expertise, but that is why they are going through a lot of consultation. They, even as recently as this week, House Republicans and Democrats, they are going through processes to consult with the experts. They are meeting with policy experts. They are meeting with AI companies. They are meeting with startups. They're meeting with researchers, academics in this space, other experts, to be able to wrap their heads around this in terms of how they want to impose new regulations. And increasingly so, they are realizing that if they were to write a law and get it signed to the president's desk, it could get dated because the technology is moving so quickly. And so increasingly, they're trying to look to the administrative agencies to be able to carry out and enforce these regulations and rely on their in-house expertise. So like the Federal Trade Commission, HHS, like all sorts of agencies will be able, some of the proposed legislation out there would direct them to more hands-on approach these technologies as governments adopt it. I mean, as government agencies adopt it and as companies adopt it, to provide guidance, to provide standards, and to provide some more targeted guardrails on the technology. So it's like a push and pull. There's also competing opinions, as I mentioned, on how to approach the technology. And so it's beyond just like trying to find that expertise, but also just trying to find agreement on what regulation looks like.
Right. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I do see that. I'm thinking about a variation on that idea. There's sort of lack of knowledge and lack of understanding. Again, when I'm hearing people talk about and consider, particularly bills aimed at algorithmic bias or decision making kinds of tools, you hear a lot of talk about this idea of the black box. That AI is sort of doing its analysis and making its recommendations, and in some cases, arguably even the people who develop the tools can't tell you exactly in a plain English
Yep.
way how that's happening and what factors are being considered. If you are using an AI tool to help you decide who's the best job candidate, and it's spitting out a list of top 5, and here's who's recommended. which factors did it emphasize and which factors were lower priority, you don't really know. And so we're seeing some shift in the state legislatures, some of the bills, not all of them, leaning more toward pushing for notice, pushing for transparency, asking the companies that develop the technology and or the companies that use the technology for decision making to basically explain to the job applicants or the consumers, or depending on the situation, how are you using this technology, what factors is it considering, and we've kind of seen this crop up in a relatively new lawsuit against Eightfold AI, and that's an interesting case that was brought in accusing the company of violating the Fair Credit Standards Act. I'm getting that name wrong, but federal credit reporting law that basically requires you to give consumers notice if their personal information is being used in a credit decision, and give them an opportunity to correct mistakes. The plaintiffs in this case are making the argument this company is selling its technology to employers, and it's sort of scraping the internet for information about these job applicants without giving them notice, without giving them opportunity to correct any errors that might be in that information. Of course, the company says, no, that's not how our technology works. It only looks at the information that's submitted in a resume or a job application, and it analyzes that and compares it to the job requirements. So, there's another one. It'll be interesting to see how the courts view that case, but I think it gets at this idea of sort of this black box problem where, in some cases, even the employers using the technology might not fully understand what's happening behind the curtain and what factors it's considering.
Yeah. And that's why you're even starting to see, new companies, new startups form to help other employers. They're called, sort of like AI training or AI governance, or companies or startups that help advise employers as they're trying to incorporate and adopt these technologies. They're going through the data to see, like, okay, yes, this is, this has minimal bias. They're trying to assess the guardrails and help employers adapt to this changing environment. Because yeah, as Chris mentioned, there is fear associated with this technology, but again, if not implemented, then employers risk, falling behind in the market.
Oma, you bring up a really interesting point about these consultants, for want of a better word, and frankly, I had not pondered that until you mentioned it. With any new technology, you have the sort of like the technology company or companies at the center, and then around it you have these burgeoning companies that are will be advising. So I think that's a whole new area of expertise that's going to need to be developed. And it might mean that there's going to be a whole new realm of opportunities for individuals like us, people on this call who deal in information, who deal in knowledge and research, different career and potential opportunities. I never thought about. Thank you for bringing that to light. When talking about companies in general, can either one of you or both of you actually talk about who are the AI companies that are most active in the lobbying and the activism on these public matters? And because I'm guessing that there are like several big players, and then there's a lot of small players who are sort of watching the big players, or just sort of jumping on the coattails of the big players. So just again, for the benefit of this group, who we deal information, we deal in knowledge, we deal in resources, it's always helpful to be able to name things. So Oma, who are some of the bigger players that you're seeing, both on the AI company side and also the lobbying shop side, who are working in this area?
Yeah, and we have a report coming out in the coming weeks highlighting the top 25 companies active in the AI lobbying
Oh,
space.
really?
So yeah, so be sure to be on the
J-
lookout for that.
Where will that be available? Like on all the Bloomberg platforms, or just
It should
Bloomberg
be. It
Law?
should be. Yes, it
Okay,
should be.
thank you for telling us that.
Yeah, and so I would say, in recent months and years, Meta leads the pack. They have have consistently spent millions of dollars on federal lobbying. We saw that this past Q1 that just came out as well. Beyond Meta, obviously the rest of the leading AI companies right now, OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, Anthropic, which has been in the news a lot lately. I'm sure we'll get to that in a bit. And so they are all spending on AI, but as well as a variety of other tech priorities and issues that relate to them. So, things like online safety, privacy, data security that affect them, competition, antitrust issues as well. But we've really seen an influx of activity. These companies have been here for a while. NVIDIA is another one of them. They have a lot of stakes here with the government now as it relates to export controls for their advanced AI chips. But those are sort of the top companies, and not to mention like Amazon, Apple, some of the other big tech giants. But you're also seeing a lot of new Silicon Valley startups coming in, and they are putting their money behind these new centers and nonprofits promoting like AI safety or AI innovation, depending on where they fall on that spectrum. You're seeing lobbying firms obviously very active on AI issues. Some of the leading firms, Ballard, Aiken Gump, Holland and Knight, DLA Piper, Monument Advocacy. Just there has just been this shift in recent years where I believe Public Citizen had a report that said 1 in 4 lobbyists in DC have lobbied on AI issues. So
Wow.
that just shows in 2025. So that just shows how dramatic of a shift we've seen in terms of the activity around this, the attention, the energy around AI. And it goes beyond just like the tech companies. Retailers have a stake in this, online businesses, healthcare companies. It's across the board where we're seeing people coming to Washington to talk about AI to address a range of their priorities.
Oma, you again, you make an interesting point. I was thinking about this in a very narrow respect, in that it's who are the AI companies, and you mentioned the typical players, but you've opened my eyes a little bit in that there are other industries such as retail, healthcare, leisure, I would presume,
Yeah.
that are also lobbying on these matters. Chris, do you have anything to add or any wisdom to share with this on that?
Yeah, I think that last point is an interesting one. Obviously, the big tech companies and the industry groups that represent them are active in the states as well. But I do think an interesting addition to that, I've heard from talking with lawmakers in Colorado as they've been working through, this sort of ongoing debate to revise the law that was passed in 2024 and hasn't yet taken effect. They're hearing from, yes, the big tech companies, but also from, state chamber of commerce and state and local industry association groups, urging around issues like, how does the liability work if there's a bias claim that results from the use of an AI tool? Is the tech company that developed the AI tool potentially liable, or is the employer who used the AI tool to make a hiring decision liable, or could they both be liable? And there's sort of this push and pull over, some of the local or state interests saying, hey, we don't want the businesses to be held liable for something the technology did that was really beyond their control, and then vice versa, the tech companies saying we shouldn't be liable for something the employer did in the way they chose to use the tool. So yeah, you're definitely seeing a lot of different lobbying interests across the board, and that's not to mention the fight over data center regulation, which I confess I haven't covered all that closely, but I know there's been a lot of push and pull in the states around that.
Interesting that the next question I have actually centers on um, data centers, and maybe Oma, maybe you can take this one sort of head on. Can you discuss the interaction of the growing resistance in localities to the large data centers and the efforts that the AI companies are making specifically in this area. I know that Maine legislature just passed a moratorium on new data centers, and here in Illinois, there's a measure winding its way through the state house as it relates to um, tax incentives for a new Bears stadium, and I believe one of the items in that bill was that there'll be no uh, tax credits, tax benefits for data centers. So, Oma, could you talk to the whole data center resistance movement, I guess you'd call it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and just to share a little context, in 2024, the 2024 election, we were often thinking like, okay, this is going to be the first AI election. We have these deep fakes, people are freaking out, like, is this election going to be decided because of misinformation and disinformation? And ultimately that didn't come to pass. The technology wasn't there yet where people were too people weren't that attuned to it just yet. I think, lots of experts are saying, and the predictions are that 2026 will be the AI election. Um, and particularly because of data centers. The public is really realizing the effects or the potential effects that data centers that are being developed in their neighborhoods, in their cities, that will have on them. And there are several effects that are being studied right now. Effects on cost, so whether it be their electricity or water bills, because of the energy required to fuel these data centers, effects on the environment, whether it's, air pollution, noise pollution, and effects on overall like living, and so that's just, a lot of people have complained, and there's been protests and rallies around even data centers replacing parks, or them being an eyesore and people not wanting to have them in their neighborhood. And so you're really seeing this at the local and state level, where communities are gathering, and to your point, yes, they are resisting. Um, they are urging state and local officials to prevent the development of new data centers. They are pushing back, and you're starting to see governments respond. So Maine state legislator did, first in the nation, a move with this moratorium, essentially saying no new very large scale data centers can be developed over the next year and a half, and we are going to study its effects. You're starting to see other states consider maybe potentially similar measures. And for the companies, this is a very drastic step in their eyes. As I mentioned before and repeatedly, they are trying to compete. They are trying to develop these data centers, get as much compute and data as possible to fuel these products, all of their different tools, coding tools, chatbots, to meet consumer demand. And so this runs counter to their ambitions and their efforts. They have been lobbying against these sort of proposals, as well as other proposals. You've seen states like Oregon and Ohio start to implement new rules for their utilities commissions to start to categorize data centers customers as a separate customer from just the regular ratepayer, to ensure that regular ratepayers are not taking on any additional costs from forming these data centers. You're starting to see the data center developers push back on that. But the pressure is being felt so much that, and a lot of these contracts that these companies enter are sort of behind the scenes, or there's not a lot of transparency into it. And so at large, you're seeing states, and now even at the federal level, people are starting to react and try to have a say. President Trump even, met with the companies to secure, commitments or pledges from the companies to ensure that their costs of forming these data centers and getting the energy to hook them up won't fall onto consumers. Congress, you have some Republican, Democratic members saying, okay, well, industry commitments are not enough. Like, we need to see some concrete regulations here to make sure they're holding true to their word and not passing on these costs. So it is, and like I said, bringing it back to the overall landscape, you will start to see lawmakers campaign on this. Voters are very aware They're not, it's no longer just a policy issue, it's a political issue. And you've even have a bill introduced at the federal level from progressives, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to pause AI data center development. I don't think that's going to pass Congress considering it's Republican controlled. And it's sort of one of the out there ideas. But yeah, it's a battle right now. I think you're seeing this battle play out at the local and state levels. The White House is waking up to it, Congress is waking up to it, and you're going to see more and more folks annoyed unless they see some response.
It's interesting the level of resistance, for want of a better word, that we're seeing to data centers. I mean, I can remember 4 or 5 years ago that communities were sort of clamoring to get data centers because they thought it was an easy way to get some tax revenue and such. But now we're seeing the fruits of what that really means, and it's again, it brings home the point that we're looking at that impacts that maybe used to be what would be seen 10, 15 years down the road. We're seeing them now 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So the window of being able to predict what these impacts will be is shortening, and it's making it can be quite unnerving, especially for policymakers, both on the local level and at the national level.
Yeah.
Oma, I
Yeah,
want to
so-
go. Please go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to add, it's a great point because, initially, just even a few years ago, several states had, introduced tax incentives, telling the companies, come build your data centers here in our state, we'll give you some tax write-offs for it. And now that sentiment is lawmakers are slowly and regulators are trying to rethink that approach because they're dealing with the public backlash. And the companies understand this now. The companies understand, like I said, like the pressure is there. They can't ignore this anymore. They can't ignore potential environmental consequences. So they're trying to work with state officials. They're trying to work with federal officials and just to be able to say like, okay, we want to be on the same page here, but we want to make sure that this is done the right way. What that looks like remains to be seen though.
Oma, I'd like to sort of change gears and hear from both you and Chris about preemption. In fact, there was an article today on BGov, and I'm going to try to read the title so that those who have access can actually read it in depth. House GOP unveils bill to override state privacy laws. Oma, since it was your byline, could you talk a little bit about specifically that article and what you're seeing in the legislation?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a similar approach that we're seeing with AI. So like I mentioned earlier, the White House and Congress is trying to create a single AI framework which would override all of these state laws and rules that we're seeing being introduced and enacted. When it comes to data privacy, the United States is one of the only like leading developed countries in the world that does not have a national data privacy law. The UK has one, the EU has one, Australia, etc. They all have one, the United States doesn't. So we've seen the similar fragmented state by state approach when it comes to data privacy. At least 20 states have data privacy laws on the books. And this is just to give consumers just basic rights over their personal information online. So a lot of them differ from each other, but the basic consensus is that consumers should be able to review, correct, or delete their personal data online that is collected by companies. And that's any online company. That's not just like a social media platform. That's also like a hotel, or that, if you're booking an online reservation, or any other sort of company online, like even a coffee shop. And so it's the federal government again is dealing with this state by state approach and trying to respond to industry demands at large to have a uniform framework that companies can abide by. And so they introduced this bill just yesterday. House Republicans have put forth this proposal that seeks to grant consumers, these basic rights over their personal information online, and it would override all these state laws. States like California, Virginia, Kentucky have all introduced these sorts of regulations. And a lot of folks are encouraged by this because they, you have many advocates say that consumer rights advocates and even some tech advocates saying that privacy regulation can serve as the foundation for AI regulation, because if we can't, the thinking is that if we can't even protect people's individual privacy and their individual data, then how can we, take on the bigger beast, which is AI regulation? And so that's sort of, probably laying the groundwork for future discussions. In terms of like a path forward, again, like I said, it's a midterm year. Congress moves slowly. It is hard to find consensus. Again, this was a Republican-only bill, so they would need to get Democrats on board to try to get this across both chambers, because they have very slim majorities in the House and Senate. But it is, there's been a lot of encouraging feedback so far just in the past day, but there is a lot of criticism still. Some folks are saying this bill doesn't go far enough, and you have states like California, again, which has led in this area and has typically been hesitant for the federal government to come in and replace their law that they have considered to be potentially weaker than the rules that they have in place at home. And so it's going to be an ongoing debate, but it's a new development.
And it's interesting, and the reason I brought this up was first to highlight the reporting, but
Thank
also
you.
the whole premise of AI is having data to work with, and if you can't feed that mechanism with individuals' data, if you're restricted in it, it's going to restrict what capabilities AI will have, the various AI platforms. And I'm presuming that the AI companies are watching this legislation very carefully because they know it's going to have impacts on how they can do business. Chris, do you have anything to add on this topic?
As far as the preemption topic, it's kind of another one of those where you have to wait and see how it plays out. The White House has tried sort of 3 or 4 different angles on, trying to get a bill through Congress last summer that would have declared, state AI legislation to be preempt, and then, threatening funding to states that the government sees as overregulating. And then the latest, you got this executive order from December that called for, the Justice Department potentially suing states to challenge laws that they see as being, preempted by existing federal law or conflicting in some way. So, there's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of sort of vague notions that, we know the White House and some in Congress would like to preempt the states, but there's also been a lot of resistance, including from Republican governors and Republican state attorneys general, at this idea of preemption. That, they've pushed back and said, hey, there are certain like safety and, as Oma alluded to earlier, protection of minors, and there are certain things that we really do think the states should maintain some authority on. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and whether the states really do end up losing authority over AI, and if so, to what degree.
I'd like to stay with this just for a moment, and move the conversation a little deeper into your world, the world of employment and labor. Are there things that the broader legislative activism on the area of data privacy can learn from the experience of what's going on or what has happened in terms of data and privacy in the employment context? Are there analogies that can be drawn, things that, oh, we know this works well in the employment and labor realm, maybe we can translate this into a larger privacy, into a larger privacy bill? I guess, do you know where I'm heading with this, Chris?
Well, I'm not sure if this quite gets at your question, but the analogy on that point, the analogy that I've heard from sources is, as Oma said, the federal government has thus far failed to pass a nationwide privacy standard, and so states have filled the void. and a lot of sources have made that comparison. Look, if Congress doesn't pass some kind of nationwide standard on AI, states are going to continue to fill that void, which they already have in a lot of sort of narrow, topical ways with, different kinds of AI bills. But I think we're going to see more of the sort of big sweeping AI decision making and algorithmic bias and other kinds of state laws pass if there isn't a federal standard.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and there are
please.
definitely lessons there. I mean, even this new federal privacy bill, it pulls from laws in Virginia and Kentucky and Texas and elsewhere, they're not starting from scratch, if you will, even though it's the beginning of the legislative process on it. They are trying to sort of replicate what the states have done and have been successful at. And you'll probably see a similar thing happen with when they make some more progress on AI.
Chris, I'd like to come back to you, and I'd like to drill into your expertise in the labor employment area. Where are you seeing AI having the biggest impacts in the employment and labor function, the hiring and the human resources management function? What are the sort of the practical implications of using AI in these functions? What are you seeing?
So, what I hear a lot from sources, they're talking a lot about the ways that companies use these tools to really screen resumes. And if you think about a really large company, a Fortune 100 kind of company that might be getting thousands of resumes a year, it's not hard to understand. Having an automated tool is really helpful to go through those resumes and weed out people who are really not qualified for the job. So from what I hear, that's a very common use. Use it for resume screening. There again, you get to that black box question of, okay, well, how is it being used? Is it really just evaluating, here are the sort of skills and educational requirements in the job, and then here are the skills and education listed on the resume, and you sort of line the two up and compare? Or are there other factors being considered that are sort of potentially getting into the realm of could be discriminatory, and it's hard to know without having some transparency requirements or some disclosures from the companies using the tool or the companies developing the tools.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. I also want to, Oma, I'd like to shift gears again and talk about export controls. I know there's a lot there's been a lot written, both especially in BGov that I've been seeing about AI and export controls measure. Can you talk about sort of the intersection between export controls and AI regulation in general, and what you're seeing being discussed both at this would probably be at the federal level?
Right. So we've seen, especially with the Trump administration, a reframing and rethinking around export controls on AI chips specifically. So those are the tools that are needed to help create these AI products, these chatbots. And so, leading company obviously here is NVIDIA, also AMD. They've been working a lot with the White House to, again, change or ease some of these export controls, which have been usually heavily restricted to foreign adversaries. The U.S. has had longstanding policy to not send its advanced, powerful technology to China. The companies are pushing back on that. They would like to enter to Beijing, to enter those markets, because their vision is that the more that you have countries reliant and using American technology, the more that they become dependent on it, and the more that American technology is going to lead the rest of the world. And then you have the opposite side of that coin, where you have some very, hawkish regulators and policymakers, both Republicans and Democrats, saying, hey, actually, the more we restrict this technology, the more the U.S. is able to lead. And we don't want to have China, especially, have their hands on some of our most powerful tools in the chance that they are potentially using this to strengthen their economic and military capabilities. this would rise to a national security risk. So this has been a very tense debate over the past year, especially. You saw the Trump administration did move to ease some of the controls on NVIDIA's chips, a line of their chips called the H200. They did allow them to start selling to China. And you've seen now in Congress a lot of lawmakers, again, on both sides of the aisle, push back because they are concerned that this will lead to a national security threat with China having more access to American technology. And so they've been introducing several new pieces of legislation that would strengthen export control restrictions, tighten them, outright ban some of the more highly advanced processors from going to foreign adversaries. And I think this is going to be a fight that's going to continue to play out this year. NVIDIA is very active in the lobbying space. It's formed very close ties. The CEO, Jensen Huang, has formed close ties with President Trump. He's on a tech advisory council, he being Jensen Huang, on a presidential tech advisory council. The company has contributed to the president's White House ballroom project. There's a lot of connections there, and so but lawmakers again are trying to push back because they are more concerned about this approach.
Thank you for that. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to poll the audience for questions, but I would like to sort of wrap up with one idea or one topic. We've all read about the conflict between Anthropic and the DoD, and sometimes we get a little bit myopic. I'm speaking for myself, that we think of AI company bad, legislation good, but it appears, and please, Oma, I hope you could talk a little bit to this about the conflict that Anthropic was involved in with the DoD, and it seemed to me from the reading that I had that Anthropic was trying to take a stand based on principle with the use of their products. So could you talk a little bit about that and how that conflict might maybe influence future legislation or influence behaviors by the AI companies when it's dealing with the DoD?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, Anthropic kind of stands on its own compared to the rest of the tech space right now, the AI companies. They have been, I mean, the founders of Anthropic are former OpenAI employees, and the reason that they split off was because they said we want to form an AI company that prioritizes, or more significantly prioritizes, AI safety and guardrails and AI safety research. And so that was really at the crux of this feud between the DoD and Anthropic. Anthropic is a leading has a leading business enterprise AI product. So a lot of businesses rely on Anthropic tools, and as well as the federal government. And it was the only tool up until this dispute that was used in classified settings by the DoD. And so essentially what had happened was Anthropic was seeking guarantees from the DoD that that their technology would not be used to domestically surveil or mass surveil Americans, and B, that their technology would not be used for autonomous weapons deployment, to always have a human in the loop. And DoD pushed back on this and said, we need to have full authority over any technology we use, especially in classified settings. A company cannot put any restrictions on how we use this technology once it's in our hands when it comes to U.S. military response. And so it's led to this lawsuits now. The DoD has moved to designate Anthropic as a supply chain risk, which is, an unprecedented move to do so on an American company. That designation is usually reserved for companies or foreign adversaries. And so Anthropic has sued in 2 different courts in DC federal court and also California. In California, they won a preliminary injunction that said, that dismissed for now, that denied temporarily for now the government's designation of them as a supply chain risk. In DC, they did not win their request, and so the litigation is ongoing. But the Trump administration and Anthropic are still in talks. they're still negotiating. They're still trying to find a deal. You know, as recently as this week, President Trump said there could be a possible for an agreement. There could be potential for an agreement there. And so it seems as though tensions have been easing, and especially, you know, against the backdrop of this new model that Anthropic has not released to the public yet, Mythos. I'm sure you've seen the headlines. They are, you know, it adds to their point that they are scared about some of this technology's potential and vulnerabilities, and so they want to ensure the proper guardrails and safety mechanisms are in place before these tools are released. So Mythos is only in the hands of two governments right now, the US government and the UK government. Only you know, a couple dozen companies have had access to it to test it, because there are very big concerns there in terms of their potential security vulnerabilities, cybersecurity risks, data breach risks. And so I think that's also, you know, this is happening at the same time as this, you know, feud between the DoD and Anthropic. And so I think that has also brought to light some of the stakes here, and probably aided their conversations to help come to an agreement.
Well, excellent. Well, we are at the top of the hour. I'm quite certain we could continue on for another hour on this topic. I want to thank Chris and Oma for their wisdom and their sharing of their insights with us today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to sit with us and to ponder this very important topic. A couple other things on a housekeeping note. I am going to try to make the recording of this available as widely as possible. This is National Library Week, so if you haven't had a chance, please visit your public library this week. Registration for the AALL conference continues. Early bird registration ends sometime next month. Get your housing in as well if you're planning on going. With that, on behalf of the Chicago Association of Law Libraries and the Government Relations Committee thereof, I want to thank you and have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. Thanks.